Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. If you can find your seats, good evening. Welcome all. My name is Tiffany Kreiner, and I teach in the English department here, and I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you tonight. Tonight is one event in our college's year-long pilgrimage with Shusaku Endo's Silence, a journey through questions that we all face, questions about the good life, about our vocations, about discipline, failure, success, and what it means to be for Christ and his kingdom. This pilgrimage brings together alumni, faculty, staff, students, community members, and especially our first-year seminar students, all of us together on the way, with Endo, with Rodriguez, with Kichijiro, and with Christ our Lord. Along the way, we have found succor at several points. We have seen relics at exhibition, our exhibition Stepping into Silence at the Billy Graham Center Museum. Each pilgrim among us can pray through silence, visually, historically, and spiritually, with the help of paintings by our speaker tonight, Makoto Fujimura, and artifacts associated with 17th century persecution of Christians in Japan. We have perked up our ears this week for clues along the way of our pilgrimage at events, at Listening to Silence, a multidisciplinary conversation contextualizing the text from perspectives of at least, by my count, 5 disciplines: literary studies, visual arts, history, Asian studies, theology. We continue our pilgrimage next spring in Looking for Silence, a screening of the film adaptation directed by Martin Scorsese, and with a panel response that brings even more disciplines into the conversation. We know that in all good pilgrimages, from Pilgrim's Progress to El Camino to Canterbury Tales, that conversation is the true sustenance of pilgrims. You pilgrims have and will be sustained by conversations in classes, around the seminar table, late in dorm rooms, at meal times with forks clanking on plates, in groups of staff and faculty talking over responses to this novel, even in families as you bring this book home with you, and online as our wider Wheaton community can connect to and come along. Now, pilgrims, as you must know, go a-begging, and it is our great privilege to thank the generosity of many who have sustained us through this pilgrimage the entire time. We thank Core Studies under the leadership of Sarah Miglio for her help, Jim Wilhoit for advice, the English department with Miho Nonaka as a key figure there, and her help associated with organizing things from Marie Friesema. We thank friends at the Smithsonian, at the Billy Graham Center Museum, especially Eric Durbin. We thank marketing and communications, especially Katie Alford. We thank the website team and video and institutional technology assistants for the online exhibition, the Oxley family and more partnerships, and Makoto Fujimura for lending us artifacts, special collections, especially David Malone and Brittany Adams and David Osielski for helping us not to wreck the artifacts that we've been loaned, and to figure out how to tell a good story. Thanks to Andy Mangan and David Hooker for helping us prepare the space, and Kelly Reed and Bob Davidson of Rule 29 Design for creating the look of the exhibition and the organization of it in space. We thank also the President's Office and Phil Reichen for his initiation of this project and ongoing support. With conversations and context, glimpses and relics, we are on our way, as Endo's novel says, to the Temple of Paradise, toward what, in my view, has got to be described as a liberal arts feast in the love of the Trinity, a feast that you'll no doubt agree seems nigh the supper of the Lamb in the community of the new creation. So I'm going to invite our president, Phil Reichen, to come introduce our speaker.
That list of thank yous was almost complete. It only left out Tiffany Kreiner, who's been such a driving force behind pulling everything together for the exhibition and so many things associated with our engagement with the novel Silence this fall. Around 1996, a New York artist and his pastor came to visit me and some of our colleagues at 10th Presbyterian Church in Center City, Philadelphia. And the artist we had was to engage in conversation around supporting Christians in the arts. Frankly, we learned a lot more than we taught in that engagement with Makoto Fujimura and his pastor, Scott Sherman. But the artist invited us up to New York City and said, if you're in New York City, I've got this show at this gallery. And just in the providence of God, a few weeks later, I was on Manhattan with Lisa and with my mother. And I said, hey, we've got to stop by this gallery. Let's look up the address. And it was absolutely one of my most joyful encounters with beauty in my whole life. I had never seen paintings like the paintings that Mako does. I particularly fell in love with his painting that's based on Psalm 42, which has a beautiful lily and has a blue background similar to this, crushed azurite. It refracts the light, so it's actually a three-dimensional painting and looks different viewed from different angles. In fact, I was so in love with the art that I was seeing that I said I would love to purchase one of these paintings, and I was somewhat dismayed to discover that everything in the gallery seemed to have been sold, particularly that painting. My wife, I think, was relieved because when you're 30 years old in pastoral ministry, you don't just have $7,000 or $10,000 to plop down on a painting. But it was just such an amazing experience of beauty. And I think the gallery owner could tell that we weren't major art investors. We didn't look like the type. But she could tell how engaged we were, how we lingered in the gallery, how we were talking about the paintings. And she said, would you like to see some more? And we said yes. And there were some additional paintings kind of in a back storeroom that had an open door. And as we approached the door, we could actually see blue light that was emanating from the room, just because of the way that the azurite surface of the painting was capturing and then refracting the light. It was as if there was a source of life and vitality and energy and beauty that was in the room, and just the sense of excitement of knowing that there was something to see that you couldn't yet glimpse. Over the years, I've tried to get my hands on anything that I could by Makoto Fujimura. I really commend to you. There are many books that have been published that have beautiful full-color reproductions of his paintings and often reflections by art critics on his art and some of Mako's own comments. It was a huge blessing for us as a family when I wrote to Mako and said, is there any way to get some prints of some of your paintings so that we could just enjoy this beauty in our own home? And I'll just say, if you're ever visiting the Riken House, I'm very, very happy to show you some of these images. So please ask so that you can see them. As I was praying with Mako as we were praying before chapel this morning, it just occurred to me what a gift it's been in my life to be awakened to beauty in a new way through his appreciation of beauty, which ultimately is a reflection of the beauty of our Savior. As he speaks on Shusaku Endo, on beauty, on silence, you're going to experience some of that beauty tonight. And I know that you'll want to join me in giving him a very warm Wheaton welcome.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me and my works in the exquisite exhibit at Billy Graham Gallery. We will go there soon after, and hopefully we can converse about the pieces, which all of the pieces are well, not all of them, but most of the pieces are from my graduate school days in Japan, when I was freshly baptized as a Christian in Tokyo, going to Tokyo University of Fine Arts, and finding myself experience transformation. And the earliest experience that was very significant to me, a spiritual reality that broke in at that time, was to witness the Fumie, and I'll go into that in a minute. This is a invitation card for my last show in New York, so it's over, but I will have another show next May there at Waterfall Mansions. There's a remarkable effort by very entrepreneurial people who wanted to do culture care, and they began a gallery really dedicated to that. And culture care is a thesis I have been speaking about. I don't own it, but it is an effort out in culture as opposed to culture wars. Instead of fighting over territories or culture, why don't we begin to take care of culture as an ecosystem, to care for artists and creative people, but also for ourselves as we think about the future and the very things that we're passionate about, the ideological principles or issues of justice and peace. These are all things that we want, and yet the world has been decimated by this polarized, divisive factions breaking out everywhere. It's a circus out there, isn't it? And so instead of fighting culture wars, producing this disfigured form of democracy, why don't we begin to care for culture? As a gardener will tend to his farm lands or garden, tilling the soil in winter, waiting for that perfect moment to plant your bulbs. We need to do the same with culture. We need to till the soil. We haven't been doing that, and so we end up fighting over this so-called limited resource environment, and we end up shooting ourselves in the foot because by the very nature to demonize the other side, we lose ourselves. So this book that I wrote, Culture Care, is about 15 years of my lectures combined together. It is being released next February by Ivy Press. So I added a new chapter in there on beekeeping. So maybe I have time to talk about that. Materials that I use, precious minerals, ground up azurite and malachite, traditionally cinnabar, and all these other pigments were used. Today it is a bit modified because of toxicity, but gold, silver, and earth colors, literally dirt from places around the world, and refined and mixed with animal hide glue, made into these layers of pigments on top of paper or silk. You can apply it on wood as well. It's a very ancient way of painting, and I have been very fortunate as a graduate student, as a national scholar, to study in Japan for 6.5 years. Learned under the masters of Nihonga lineage leading back to 15th century. To this day, I am still the only outsider of the system. By that I mean you have to go through 4 years of training as an undergraduate at the university before you can apply to the MFA and before you are invited to be considered for a doctorate. Only 2 students gets into the doctorate program per year. I am still to this day the only outsider ever been invited to apply for the lineage program at the highest level of training. And I look back on that time, and I look back on my my journey of being born in Boston, going to Sweden. My father is a research scientist, and then ending up in Japan for grade school, and then middle school and high school in New Jersey. And I went to Bucknell University in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. I graduated, got married to my dear wife, who I met the first day of college. And so I did very well. And we went to Connecticut, where she was getting her master's in psychotherapy, and I was working at a special education school. And then received a scholarship to go to Japan and learn this technique of Nihonga. Nihonga is literally translated Japanese-style paintings. And it is a term that they coined in 19th century to distinguish Japanese form from the Western paintings, yoga. And there are disputes, and it's a contested word, whether this word is actually a word that can be used to trace back to, as I said, 15th and even beyond 8th century. But I think the lineage there is significant and strong enough to make that argument. And so I use this word as a term that distinguishes this very unique ecosystem of artisans and artists working together, utilizing and refining nature's materials into a collaborative way of painting. And this is something that people who ask me about Nihonga, I always try to explain to them, it's not just the materials, it's not just the technique. You can certainly, learn to use minerals. I mean, it's ubiquitous. It's all over the world. Every culture uses minerals at one point. But the word Nihonga is an ecosystem of people who are committed to create beauty. And in order to understand that, you really do have to go to Japan and have to learn the language and customs and be introduced to a very small society of groups of people dedicated to paper making and brush making and Fumie ink and so forth. There is a network of diehard purists who are doing this despite there's no governmental support for this in Japan, actually. It's surprising to find out, but it's true. And it is an endangered form. It is an art form that is rapidly disappearing. Every year you hear of a paper maker passing away, and that paper will never be made again. Because even though they are passed on to the next generation, the knowledge of that making is so complicated and so tacit that you can't write it down, or you can be learning from a master for 10 years and still not get to the level of paper making for someone who's been making paper for 30, 40 years. So this is a dying form. I call it slow art, just like slow food. It's a way of slowly even raising the mulberry to make sure that it is the right type of growth for paper making. Last time I was speaking to a silk maker, and he gave me a roll. He said, I want to give this to you. This is the last roll of this type of silk. Because the silk maker raised silkworms in certain ways. That is no longer done. And the silk made by these silkworms that were raised specifically to make the silk for this the silk roll that he was giving it to me, actually. He said, I know you will use it well. This is the kind of relationship that Japanese beauty has depended on for so many years in Japan. Beauty is connected to relationships. And this ecosystem of hospitality and understanding. And there's no accident that my thesis of culture care looks a lot like Japan. Of course, I think as a Christian reading the narratives of the Bible, that it makes sense as God has given us this responsibility to steward creation, that we are to assume the thriving abundance of creation and the new creation. And God wants us as children of God to become part makers into that world. And so beauty matters, and collaboration is the language of our making, not only with each other, but with precious natural resources. And so it is important for us to understand that as we move into the future, that our making capacity under biblical guidance is enormously part of the gospel, part of how we become fully human, this full community of lives that is assuming this thriving will take place someday, perhaps not on this side of eternity, but we can in some ways tap into that reality to come today. So I think about that every time I use my pigments. Here I am in my Pasadena studio. I just began this journey as the director of Brehm Center. I spent about 3-4 months out of the year there, directing the Brehm program, which is part of Fuller Seminary, to connect the dots between worship, theology, and culture, and the arts. It is an integration point, and I'm excited to begin my journey there to insist on this integration happening at the highest level of theological discourse, that students learn to integrate their theological formation and spiritual formation and cultural formation at the same time. I want to see a generation of young people, theologians, pastors, artists, musicians, business folks, nurses, doesn't matter. Everyone can be part of this vision for integration that culture care calls for, that we are to bring into every discipline this attentiveness and this integration and collaboration that Nihonga artisans would care about. So I'm excited to journey there into that. This very large piece I'm working on was shown at my last exhibit. It's a horrible reproduction, but you can get the size, scale, and you can see the minerals falling and cascading if you look closely at the surface. And it takes a while to actually see my paintings, and I tell people you actually have to stand in front of it for at least 10 minutes before you can see it. And a lot of people don't have the patience to do that, so they just walk away. But if you do stand in front of my paintings, even the smaller ones there, especially the Walking Water sketch or Golden Sky, you will start to see things after a while. Your eyes are able to see them, but your brain, it will say no, because we're so trained to categorize our experiences and to truncate what we are seeing, what we're hearing, what we're experiencing. Partly for survival reasons. You can't survive if you don't do that, but artists tend to be those running away from the pragmatic, utilitarian pragmatism that pervades our world. So I want to help people see. I want to invite people to the actual creative processes that happens in my studio. This is my barn in Princeton that I'm so privileged to work in, and converted horse barn that that is just so ideal for Nihonga and this rhythm. You can see the garden next to it or in front of it, and that is the rhythm that I often want to invoke in my work. This is slow art. This is tilling the soil, watching the tulips grow. So when Jesus commanded us to consider the lilies, that means to me planting the lilies and watching the lilies grow, and observing and perhaps seeing the lilies for the first time, realizing this amazing reality in front of me is moving and opening up something new every moment. And so my studio is a place of this meditative, contemplative practice, and I do consider what I do as worship and prayer, and it is so amazing that I get to do this all day, and and everything I do, whether it be directing a Brahms Center or writing or books, everything flows out of there. In fact, I should tell you that my job description at the Brahms Center is to paint. I get fired if I'm not painting. I love my job. But the reason why Mark Labaton, the president of Fuller Seminary, challenged me to do this is because he saw the future of the church, future of seminary education, drastically shifting, and that the old wineskin is breaking. And the new, we have to figure out what is the future of the church. And I have thought for many years as an artist, well, God of the Bible is an artist. God is the creator. God understands poetry. Half of the Bible is poetry. I was just recently corresponding with theologian N.T. Wright, and I asked him about this perspective. Am I reading into the Bible too much to say that God is an artist? And he came back with this exquisite, of course, letter of exegesis of Philippians. And he said, I have discovered that the poetry, the hymn of praise in Philippians, that artistry, is not a peripheral expression, but it is a central expression. Poetry is at the heart of the gospel. And so this artistry, this making, singing, dancing, creating, is central to the gospel and central to biblical text. So I think with Mark that 21st century church should look more like a studio or a theater or music hall, or places where creativity is abounding, but with this imaginative direction toward the future that only God can create through us and with us. So, as we are discussing Silence and Beauty, and Shusaku Endo's Silence. I'll go into some historical details. I'll come back to this thesis of making, what I call theology of making again. But I took this photo when the books were finally done, and first book you open as an author is such an exhilarating experience. So I wanted to have this photo in there, but to write this book was really excruciating because it took me 2 years following after Shusaku Endo, the 20th century Catholic writer of Japan, whose book unexpectedly became a runaway bestseller in Japan, even though there's only less than 1% Catholic population in Japan. And his book is about the trauma that the Japanese have caused these foreign missionaries in 17th century. So you offend the Japanese and you offend the Catholics at the same time, what a plan, right? To write your bestseller. In fact, the diocese in Nagasaki banned the book. And Endo, in his postscript, in the second edition of the book, thanked the diocese of Nagasaki for helping him to sell the book. Yes. And he also said in the postscript, this I spoke about this morning a little bit. He said, many have criticized me as a Catholic that I could write such a novel that could be called a novel of grace. Are you a Protestant? Some said. But I take that to heart, and I'm grateful for that comment. A writer novelist of grace. Endo thought of himself that way, even though the story is about this torturous past that everybody wanted to deny, run away with. Indeed, the historic character of Giuseppe Chiara, the Italian Jesuit priest who went into Japan with Portuguese missionaries in the early 1600s. He has been forgotten from history. There's a little plaque in Tokyo, Shitamachi district of Tokyo, but that's about all he's left. Endo discovers 2 pages of notes, historical documents, notes from the keeper of the prison that he was imprisoned in for some 30, 40 years. I won't spoil the end of the book just in case you haven't read it. But this trauma that this priest went through, and he dares to write a story from this invisible voice erased in history. He digs that up. By the way, if you're going to read this book, read it to the end. By the end, I mean the appendix. The appendix is this letter, historical document that Endo tweaked only slightly. You need to read this document, but don't read it first and think that will solve the problem. Because the letter, this innkeeper's notes will not make sense unless you read the whole thing. Masterfully crafted novel. Every detail counts. As I said this morning, he's like a mystery novelist, and he sets you up as a reader. And the first clues that you find about the nature of the book, the reality of the characters in the book, they turn out to be all misleading. But you have to pay attention to your own heart in response to what you read and how you respond to these characters. Because that reveals actually much about your journey through trauma. And at the end of the book, 5 people sitting in the room may have all different reactions because all of us have different experiences, especially with the past, especially with our own cultural history, with our own limited perceptions, our own racism, our own structures that we set up in our lives to unintentionally judge against another, against our neighbor, but against ourselves sometimes. All these things are exposed. And our traumas are exposed. I knew that going into writing this book. That's why I didn't want to write it. I told my friend who became my agent, and he's a co-producer for the film Silence, Scorsese's, what I think will be a master work. He asked me to write this book. He said, Marco, you're the only person who can write this book. This is about a 17th century story. You studied that period. You went to Japan to study this aesthetics of 17th century. You became a Christian while doing it, and you encounter these Fumies at Tokyo National Museum. That has changed how you view life and faith. You need to write this, and I kept on turning him down. I didn't want to write this. I didn't want to revisit the traumas of my past. And so he finally said, well, would you like to talk to Marty about it? Sure, I'll talk to Martin Scorsese about my reluctance to write this book. Yeah. So I ended up in his home in New York and spent about an hour with him. We had a lot in common because we were both parents, and he has a 12-year-old daughter who he loves. And it was very clear to me that this film was not like the Wolf of the Wall Street or these other films that he made. This is more in vein of Hugo. This is a dedication film to the craft of filmmaking, to Endo, who he feels he owes much to. No one knows why, except when The Last Temptation of Christ film came out over 25 years ago. And those of us who remember that will remember the culture wars breaking out. He became this poster child of culture wars. He said, I was so surprised by that reaction. Because he said, I went to Catholic seminary, and these are all the questions that we were talking about in Catholic seminary. Why would people get upset over a dream sequence? Well, Archbishop Moore, then the Episcopal Bishop of New York, came up to Martin Scorsese at one of the premieres, and he said, Martin, if you want to wrestle with your faith, this book is the way in. Gave him silence. He was on his way to Japan to work on one of Akira Kurosawa's last films. When he landed in Narita, he called his office and he said, I must, because he read Silence on the plane. He said, I must get the rights to this story. This is my story. That was over 25 years ago. Around the time that I'm wrestling with my art, my faith, around the time when I encountered 19 plates at Tokyo National Museum of Fumies constructed during 17th century. I'll go back to that. And this man's this is a wonderful photo of him, written by Muneya Kato, one of his key students who became sort of a disciple and he wrote this amazing biography of Shusaku Endo, which is unfortunately not translated yet, but it should be. It's the best book to discover and meet Endo face to face, to understand why he wrote silence the way he did, and what he regrets of why the title that he named his first novel was not Silence. He talks about all of that in this book. And I got to meet Kato-san, spend time with him, told him about my book, and he was he encouraged me because he said, I don't think anybody has connected this word beauty with Endo. And you could tell by his face that he was excited about it. Endo had this humor about him. He would always stand in a lecture like this, and he'll come up on stage and he'll start by saying, "You think I'm very serious, don't you?" And he'll make jokes or make silly jokes that really is sometimes hard to get, and people weren't sure if they were supposed to laugh or cry. And he'll just make fun of himself a little bit, and then he'll start to talk, and I listened to his lectures over and over, and I realized that he's actually, in his talks, as he does with his essays, he is separating the sheep from the goats. He is actually trying to reach certain types of people. And he will, of course, speak in general terms that would invite everybody to consider whatever he's talking about, the themes of his conversation. But he is so masterful in disguising his true message that only after a while you realize the very thing that he didn't say is the most important thing. And in order to do that, you have to read his novels. And so, you go on this journey, and I listened to one of his lectures, and I thought, oh, he didn't answer that question, or he set himself up to say this, and he didn't. And I just have to read Deep River, which is what he was talking about. Okay, all right. So I read Deep River, I go back to the lecture, and then I discover another clue that he embedded in his talks. Intentionally, I'm sure, so that those who want to find out deeper meanings about his journey and his novels will have these trails. And so he was, playing games with us in a way. He was setting us up for a conversation that is at a time when trauma was the existential reality in Japan, at a time when Christianity was not spoken of. And he was doing these public lectures to actually draw people to Christ. And after a while, I became aware of this, and I was amazed at the mastery of his craft, not just in novels, but in lectures and everything he did. He was on TV in commercials, and he created another name, Korean, as not a pseudonym, because everyone knew it was Endo, but it's kind of a comedic stage name. And he would come into these game shows, make fun of himself, do silly things. And so there's multifarious view of Endo. But I began to love this man as a human being after a while. And I could see why Scorsese would be obsessed by silence and Endo. For 25 years, he tried to make this film, and no film studio would buy it. It's a very difficult story, as it offended everybody in Japan. Who's going to watch this film, right? Who's going to care about this invisible voice buried beneath Japanese history? But he's onto something, because both of them realize, I think, something very significant about Nagasaki. Nagasaki is a place of trauma, but it is also a place of faith. When the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki, because the clouds just parted for a moment and they could see the target. It was supposed to be dropped in a military compound about 50 miles west. It was about 10 a.m. And when you walk into the Atomic Memorial Museum in Nagasaki, the first thing you see is a melted church with stained glass windows like bees on the ashes. It is left intact as it is, surrounded by windows. More Christians died on that day than 250 years of those who were martyred. In a single morning. And you have to realize that Nagasaki has been the center of faith activities, where hidden Christians came out after the edict of 250 years was repealed. And they rebuilt the churches. These were the faithful remnants of Japan. And 10 o'clock, they were all there at their churches praying. And evaporated in a single moment. All of that history. Endo wanted to capture that history. So after recuperating from 3 surgeries, experiencing tremendous debilitation of his body, he suffered from tuberculosis. He ended up in an isolation ward in Paris when he was a student. That was a very important experience, as it turns out, but at the time, it felt like he felt like he was a complete failure. Doctors gave him 5 years to live. So he went to Nagasaki to write his novel, maybe his last novel and only novel. He wanted to write a story of a survivor of the bombing, a woman who he will end up writing about later. But then he walked into the Municipal Museum of Nagasaki, and he encountered Fumie, the stepping blocks that you see on the display here, and I'll show you a very special Fumie in a minute. But he realized that in order to depict the trauma of 20th century, you actually have to depict the trauma of 17th century. These are the martyrs of Nagasaki, 1597. Before the edict was passed, 27 martyrs marched from Kyoto to Nagasaki, because now Christianity was forbidden in Kyoto. And these heroes of our faith journeyed with their ears were cut so they would bleed as they walked. An incredible story is that 3 boys joined them as they marched. Everybody tried to talk them out of it, but they kept on marching. And when they got to Nagasaki, this picture shows this small crosses, but there were no crosses for them. So the 13-year-old brother said, "Where is my cross?" And his 12-year-old younger brother said, "Show me mine too." I stood there on this martyr hill overlooking Nagasaki. Ground zero is about a mile away. There used to be an ocean in front of it where they would throw the bodies into. And this reality, right, that today we can look back on in our textbooks and maybe think about. Certainly in a Christian college, we may have heard of these events all over the world, and it is happening today too. But this weight of this trauma, it just hits you. And you see what both Scorsese and Endo realized, that the traumas of today has to be wound back into such a place, the martyrs' hill in 16th century Japan. In order to understand this is the sculptor Funakoshi, famous sculptor in Japan, created these. They are the boys. In order to understand this, you have to go back in time. And somehow Endo realized this when he saw Fumie in the municipal museum in Nagasaki, very similar to the ones that you have here in Wheaton. This is a different one. This is the original Fumie, created by Yusa Hagiwara, a metalsmith of 17th century in Nagasaki. And this is really true what happened, although there are some anecdotal stories surrounding this man's life, and I'm not quite sure how much is historical, how much is made up, but the story is that Father Ferreira, played by Liam Neeson in the movie, the giant of faith, he is the Billy Graham of his day. Jesuit priests sent their best to Japan because it is the end of the world. It is to fulfill the Great Commission. They sent their best, and the students, Father Rodriguez, played by Andrew Garfield, Father Gape, played by Adam Driver, cannot believe the news that Father Ferreira has apostatized. He is now writing books against Christianity, this giant of faith that they learned from, they were mentored by, they looked up to. They could not believe this news. That is the beginning of silence, that they endeavored to go to Japan and to see what happened with their own eyes, to follow their master. And persecution begins, and magistrates need to find out who are the Christians hiding away in their villages. So they devise a plan. First it was on paper, but they paint a drawing of Jesus. And they ask everybody to step on it. And Japanese apparently are so visual and so honest that you can actually tell that somebody is hiding something. Well, the papers don't last long. So the story goes that Father Ferreira thought that because he is from Rome, there is, you can create bronze cast images. And he went to a Buddhistic statue metalsmith to cast this very Fumie that I saw on that fateful day in Japan as a graduate student when I first encountered these Fumie blocks. And of course, what is so haunting about them, right? All 19 of them lined up. They were worn smooth. For with 250 years of people walking on them, they were worn smooth. You could hardly tell the face of Jesus. And the historical record says that this man, this Buddhistic statue maker, a metalsmith, Yusa Hagiwara, who made these, brought these to the magistrates. And magistrates were very pleased with them. And yet they called them back and they said, these are extraordinary. And we will use these because they are going to work very well for us. But we also recognize that you must be a sympathizer because they're so beautifully made. So he was martyred, despite the fact that he kept on saying, I will step on the Fumie. Just, let me prove to you that I'm not a sympathizer. It doesn't matter. He was martyred with the saints of the past. This artist who did his work so well. So I began to create pieces after this experience of encountering Fumies like this. And there's one in the exhibit. It's called Passion Panel Series. It's a small square. And you might think, well, what is that? Well, it's just a square, red square. But it is a surface that's been painted over and over. Every day I came in as a ritual, I would paint them over and over. There's probably like 100 layers on it or something like that. I didn't count, but it became this ritual for me. Every morning I would paint, and then I would use sandpaper to sand it down and paint again, and sand it down and paint again, scratch it, create this emotional surface of the Fumie and the cross, right? Crucifix. Part of the crucifix is meant to be part of the crucifix. It is this tiny square, but in modern art, squares have definitive meaning. And I'm quoting Russian Orthodox Christian painter who couldn't paint his icon, so he started to paint just white squares. Kazimir Malevich did this over and over, and Alfred Barr, the founder of Museum of Modern Art, found these in France, brought them to what will become the Museum of Modern Art that began the modernist movement in New York. These white squares that was made because he was not allowed to make icon writings or icon paintings. So I'm making these images over and over, and for my thesis project, for my lineage doctorate program, I made this installation called The Resurrection, and you see a drawing in the exhibit made after this. But literally placing paperworks on the floor, making them very vulnerable, and that this is my evocation and my invoking of the Fumie panels. And here's another version which was shown in a gallery in Tokyo, now a collection of Yokohama Museum of Art. And last time I was there, they had installed it for their group show of their collection show, and I hadn't seen it in 20-some years. Part of it is the silver that oxidates. I use silver in this, and so unless you protect the surface, they will darken over age, and I want them to darken. And so they were beautifully darkened, and I was very happy to see that. Let me end with some just tidbits of my book, History of Japan. Fascinating details that I go into in the book, and I'll quickly go over them. This is the view that Endo saw before, as he imagined Father Rodriguez coming into this cove in Sotome, Nagasaki, Japan. It's a cove, as you can see, it's mountainous. It's only about 2 miles from Nagasaki city, but it takes about an hour and a half to get there. Because of all the switchbacks, roads, and this is why the Christians hid in that region. It's hard to go up there. He stood on this hill imagining 2 priests, young priests, sneaking into Japan. There is a Shusaku Endo museum there, and I'm happy to say that next August, my colleagues for Fujimura Institute, Suzy Barra, composer, percussionist, visionary, Andrew Nemmer, a tap dancer, and also a pastor and a visionary, and I will be collaborating to commemorate the 76th anniversary of the bombing in Nagasaki. The collaboration, of course, is a dedication to Endo and theme of silence and beauty. I want to introduce you to a tea master, Senno Rikyu. I talk about him in the book. I have a chapter or two discussing the rich, layered history of what took place in Kyoto during that extraordinary time of history when there were 300,000 Christians in Japan. And in Kyoto, the percentage of Christians probably edged like 40%. It's a remarkable number when you think about it. Rikyu is well known for his art of tea. Everybody who studies Japanese culture will say the art of tea that Rikyu invented in 1500s, before the persecution began, is the most important art form of Japan. But most people don't realize the close connection, and possibly even more than that, Rikyu had to Christianity. In that time in Kyoto, when there was this huge surge of Christians, people turning to Christ, Rikyu invented a very unique art form of tea, taking what the Chinese brought into Japan, Koreans brought into Japan, and modifying it, and making the tea house smaller, and this communication style that is based on silence, but is also based around passing of a cup. And with little morsel that is served at the beginning of this, before you drink the cup. You cut into this sweet morsel. You taste that, and the green tea is a little bitter, and you go through the ritual, and you take part in this Eucharistic ceremony. Now, if you ask a Japanese, certainly a tea master, or any Japanese, about connection, this obvious connection with the Eucharist and tea ceremony of Japan, there will be no answer whatsoever. My book will uncover some of it, and I'm curious to see what the experts will say about this. My assistant in Japan is studying to be a tea master. It takes 16 years. She's in her 8th year. So she has had many opportunities to ask her tea master about this possible link to Christianity. And every time she asks, her tea master says, no, there's no connection. But now, we discovered this many times. There are places in Kyoto that you can go to observe traditional tea. As you can see, it's a very small room. It's the smallest is 2.5 mats, which is Japanese tatami mat. So you can see it's very small. This is the famed black raku tea bowl that the Rikyu used to serve the power, the dictator of the day, who he knew hated black, in order to communicate to Ieyasu that invasion of Korea and invasion of China is not to the Japanese interest. He served tea in this black bowl. And I'm going to say about 2 months later, I have to fact check that, Rikyu was asked to commit suicide in the same tea house dedicated to peace. Power struggles behind the scenes in feudal times in this, what is called Sengoku Jidai, which is literally war period in Japan. An artist, a tea master, dared to bring in this Eucharistic form of art to celebrate communication and peace. That sounds like Christianity to me. You walk into the Mecca, the most important temple in Kyoto, Daitokuji Temple, dedicated to Zen Buddhism, dedicated to Rikyu, and you find 2 sub-temples. One called Suikoin, which has a plaque that says, here is a sub-temple of Daitokuji that is dedicated to a Christian daimyo. And you will find, this is literally on the plaque, all tourists will see this, the Japanese will see this, read this, if they read such a thing, before going in. You will find that there are many hidden crosses, such as this garden, 7 stones, referring to the 7 disciples of Rikyu, laid out in a very subtle manner, subtle cross, going this way and that way. And the monk, presiding monk of this sub-temple, as we were touring this with a quartets group, Fujimura Institute team that went to Hiroshima and then Kyoto, he came running out to explain to us that we need to understand that this temple is dedicated by Christians. That's the but. There is a tea room, a famous tea room at the end of this garden, and dedicated by one of Rikyu's disciples. who founded this temple, another sub-temple in this Mecca of Zen Buddhism, called Suikoin, who took this broken lantern. You can see the stone on the right hand, upper hand is broken, right? Because this dictator, this Ieyasu, wanted this lantern from Rikyu, as he wanted his daughter as a concubine. Rikyu refused his daughter, and then he went to the backyard and took a hammer and broke the upper corner as a form of resistance to this dictator, feudal dictator. And when he was asked to commit suicide ritual, he brought this lantern to the daimyo who founded this temple, Hosokawa. And Hosokawa took also a hammer and he broke it even more in honor of his master. And here, in front of this plaque, is the story of Hosokawa's wife, Garesha Hosokawa, a famous figure in Japan. It's actually in Pokemon, she's so famous. This amazing Christian woman who threw her life away for her husband's reputation. She is buried here, near this lantern. And this is the story, the subplot, literally, of Japanese history, hidden inside this most important temple of Japan. So I write about this in my book. I hope you read it. And I don't know if we have time for questions. Do you want to? No? Okay, I'm getting a no. So I thank you for patiently listening to my narrative here. I thank you so much for the team here to have created a wonderful exhibit. For those of you who are reading Silence, let me know how I can serve you further into your journey. Endo is a novelist of compassion. So journey with us into that world. Thank you very much.